as I start this conversation with you, let me ask you for a moment to take a second and think about a time when you experienced leadership at its best. Just go to a place where you remember leadership at its best. Now think about a word that helps you describe that, one single word. I know it's hard. Now think about an image that represents that word. Looking at the web, when you look for the word leadership, this is the type of images that you get. However, you also, if you look very hard, you can also get these types of images. Notice the difference between these and these. In fact, these are two very different ways of thinking about leadership. And what I'm going to argue that today we're going through a very important shift that goes from our mental models, our mental understanding of leadership, from a leader-centered approach to a connectivity-focused approach on leadership. And this shift is happening because there are broader shifts happening in society that allow us to realize that nowadays there is no one single wicked problem, important problem of concern to all of us that can be solved by a single individual or a single group. In fact, each stakeholder may have a little bit of the power, a little bit of the capabilities to help solve the problem, but no one can solve them on their own. What we need actually is the connectivity among many groups or individuals with their own capabilities to bring and join them together to be able to do something different. And so think about it, for example, in the context of a children's service policy. The Scottish government has imagined this aspiration that they would like Scotland to be the best place to grow up and bring up children. How can they do that? They understand that they need to bring together politicians, parents, public servants, and the public, because each of these stakeholders has a little bit of the power, a little bit of the capabilities, but none of them can solve or address the problems that a child-centered approach needs. And so what leading collectively is about is precisely bringing people, creating the space where this connectivity can happen. In fact, we need to realize, or it's very exciting to know, that the big innovations in public service are all about creating this collectivity. You may be familiar with some of these efforts or interesting ideas that are happening around us. And what you will know is that all of them are about how do we bring together people or stakeholders or groups with very diverse and important resources, interests, power. How do we bring them together so that they realize we're in this together, we have a common concern, and we know what to do about it in a very seamless way. That's what leading collectively is all about. In fact, it's about figuring out how in an environment of collaborative governance, you can actually bring everyone on board and have them develop their own leadership and take up their own leadership to do the piece that they can do together. So that's where a shift in leadership theory is happening, where before the leadership theories were much more centered on the leader, and now we're focusing more on the collective dimensions of leadership so that we can figure out how to do this kind of leading collective better. What is interesting about all these different approaches is that, of course, we understand there are visible leaders. They're not going to disappear, but they play a very different role. So in fact, we think about leadership as something that is the tip of the iceberg. And in fact, there's a lot under, excuse me a second, there's a lot under the water that's as important as what's happening for the visible leader. And so this is something that you may want to consider. We can also think about the leader as part of a larger whole, so that the system moves because everyone moves together, not just because the leader is out there pointing. In fact, what collective leadership theories are saying is what leadership is work. It's the work of getting to make meaning together as a group of the things that we need to do. And in fact, it's about figuring out together what's the direction that we need if we have a concern that involves all of us. How do we align the different resources and capabilities that we have, and how do we get to commit each other, to commit with one another and with the purpose that we have in mind. So leadership is work to create DAC. DAC is a collective achievement. So collective leadership is about leadership as a collective achievement. However, how do we do that? My students always say, Okay, that sounds fascinating, but very abstract. How do we do that? And in fact, given that we're going through a shift, we are all living this existential moment when we realize, you know what? We want a different kind of leadership, but how do we get there? And we don't have it because we still have hierarchical systems. So it's an existential moment that looks just like what you see in the screen. Also, this kind of leadership has not been studied sufficiently. And so the research that has been done tends to be in corporate settings. But how do we think about leading collectively in the context of governance problems, in the context of public service? Well, it turns out that social change organizations have been doing this for a long time. Social change organizations are grassroots nonprofit organizations working with marginalized communities to try to make sure that they can take up their leadership to do the work that they need to do to change the conditions that they need to change. And so in working with these kinds of organizations, we've been trying to ask, how does leadership happen in this context where, in fact, what you have is organizations in environments of great scarcity, or what appears to be great scarcity, and they are able to convert this scarcity into abundance and produce amazing results that really are about changing things at the policy table and changing systems. And so what I want to do is to give you an illustration with one particular organization about how leadership happens in this context. What does it mean to lead collectively? So that you have a sense of that this is actually possible. So here's the Young Women's Freedom Center, an organization in Oakland. And they are working with girls or young women who have been involved with the juvenile justice system or who are at risk of getting there. Notice their mission and their vision. It's really about creating a new world, a new system where these women can actually thrive. It's a very, very exciting organization. And the work that they're doing is really about figuring out how to bring these girls and have them work together with them in the problem that they're addressing. So they do work in prevention. And so they go out and do work with young women who are engaged in the street in prostitution, in gangs, in all kinds of issues that they've had to deal with in order to survive. These are young women who have grown up in poverty. They also do work with the women who are actually in prison and help them to support them to heal, to figure out how they can live in a better place when they're out of the prisons. And they also do reentry work. And in fact, they hire young women who have gone through the process before to be peer advisors so that the women who are coming out get to be supported in this context. So with that in mind, what's the leadership work? How do they lead collectively? Well, we found that one of the ways in which the work of leadership happens in this organization is by reframing discourse. Look at this statement that is from their web. It's about young women who have been misunderstood. Reframing is about thinking differently and challenging the way we've defined the problem, actually, that these women have had, and to think about how do we think about it differently so that we can come up with different kinds of solutions. And when you do this reframing, you have a sense of the direction that the organization has to take. Reframing then is about imagining a new narrative that interrupts the narratives that have helped create the problem. And when you do reframing, you have to imagine a different language because you cannot change the world with the language that is supporting and reinforcing the problems that are in the world. And so the new vocabulary is really important. In this organization, the peer advisors are called self-determination coaches. Think about the importance of that language and what that does for the young women who are working with them. In addition, we have unleashing human energies as another type of work that happens in these organizations. This is about creating the conditions where these young women can learn and unlearn some of the things. They need to unlearn the messages that they've had about themselves, and they also need to learn new ways of thinking about themselves so that they understand that, in fact, they have control over some of the circumstances in their lives. When this happens, you also have a big reframing happening. And so the idea is, how do we create the capability for these young women to understand that they have something important to give so that they can change the world? In fact, an example of this is they participate in task forces and city commission. This is the City Commission on Youth Prostitution, where the statement is, you are the expert. These women are the expert on what's going on. They have lived experience that is absolutely important. So they can go there and challenge the adult and the policymakers who are imagining these things in the air, but who don't have an idea of what it means to live in the street. And so what you have here is young women who know that if they're going to be presenting in a commission, they have to prepare themselves. They have to learn about the policy issues. They have to learn communication skills. And so the entire pedagogical approach, the training that happens, is very much based on what and how they want the young women to participate in creating the conditions for a different kind of reality. The last type of leadership work that's happening, we call it bridging difference. And this is about, think about this. You have these young women who come from the street. They've been participating in gangs. They hate each other. Or they think of their experience in very different terms. Oh, I'm an African American. I have a very different experience to the white girls who are coming here. And so part of the internal work is about creating the space where people can recognize what is common to them. What are some of the oppressions that are common and that allow these young women to realize that they're not, that this is not their fault, that this is part of a survival strategy that they went through, and that you have the reframing that what we need to do is not to punish them, but to support them, so they create the supportive systems that are there. And so this is kind of internal work. The story circles allow people to tell stories about where they were and for others to recognize themselves. And this is very bonding. This is very connecting. Also, there is a lot of external bridging that needs to happen. And this is illustrated in the work with the Department of Juvenile Justice, where basically the organization goes and says, look, we have the expertise that you need to understand what to do with women who are in prison. You don't have the resources. Let us do it for you. And in fact, they're able to have the authorities say, okay, go and do it, something that is unprecedented, that hasn't really happened. So they're developing a curriculum and training the women in a way that's absolutely fantastic. So here is a quote from actually one of the leaders in one of these organizations that really reinforces this idea that leading collectively is about creating the spaces where others can take up their leadership and understand what is the direction that we need to take together, how do we align the different work that we need to do together, and how do we make sure that we're committed to one another. So leadership work, leading collectively, is about helping create the DAC in an organization. So what this tells us in terms of insights is that, yes, of course, the technologies of management are important. You need to know how to run an organization. Yes, of course, the critical task of the organization is important. In a hospital, it's important to learn about healthcare, in a university, about education, and in these kinds of organizations, about these kinds of activities. However, that's not enough. You also have to learn about the invisible work of leadership that is happening, and that, in fact, is what gives meaning and value to the work that people are doing in the organization, be them staff or working with these constituents who experience the problem. And so it is this expressive work of leadership what actually gives meaning and helps to produce the collective understanding of DAC in each particular context. So, well, of course, if you're a leader and you lead in a traditional environment, you can do work. It's going to happen. But if you lead collectively, you're going to create a more sustainable approach. It's because what you're trying to do is really create an ongoing learning community or an organization or an environment full of leadership, a leaderful environment. And that's what the work of leadership is when you're thinking about leading collectively. So as you think about where you're going to do your graduate studies, I urge you to take into consideration how and when you're going to learn not only about the technical part of the work, but also about the more expressive, value-driven part of the work that needs to happen independent of where in the system you are located. In fact, I ask you and urge you to think back to the word and the image that was in your mind when you thought about leadership. Think about where you are there in terms of this leadership shift, and what do you need to do to develop the capabilities that you will require to be able to become a leader independent of where you are in the system, and from there, develop leadership in others from your own sphere of influence. Thank you.